Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It is a beautiful, beautiful sunny day in Geneva. So for those of you in the WTO, the challenge will be to focus on the presentations and not at the beautiful view of the lake. And for those of you who are joining us from Latin America and the Caribbean, I know we have a number from both regions on the online audience. So good morning to all of you. Welcome to this seminar, which is organized by the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, along with the Pew Charitable Trusts and the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment and Sustainability at Duke University, which focuses on trade policy options to address plastic pollution. I'm Alice Tipping, and I'm the director of IISD's trade and trade policy work. You know, we know essentially why we're all here. We know that the convenience and the low cost of plastic have turned it into an integral part of the modern economy. We know also that it's generated one of the major environmental challenges we face in the 21st century. We know that it's causing damage to human health, to ecosystems, and to the climate. And we know that the trajectory that we're currently on is not great. Business as usual will essentially triple the amount of plastic that's used by 2060, and equally tripling the amount of plastic waste to almost 44 million tons of plastic leaking into the environment by that time. But there is hope. Our colleagues at the Pew Charitable Trusts published a report many of you will be familiar with called Breaking the Plastic Wave. And that report shows us that it is possible to cut annual flows of plastic into the ocean by about 80% over the next 20 years by applying existing solutions and technologies. We know also from a policy and a government perspective that there are multilateral efforts underway to take action to reduce the production and consumption of plastics. Those are taking off in the UN's negotiations on a legally binding agreement on plastic pollution, plastics and plastic pollution. We know that there's work underway in the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions, for example. But we also know that a number of actions, a number of policy reforms have already been taken by economies individually, economies that recognize how unsustainable the current situation is and have recognized a need to change it. So this event essentially aims to help you all, governments and policymakers in capital, with a sense of the state of play. So what are governments, including your governments, already doing? And to provide you with those research insights applied to the question of what could you do next? We're going to build this picture in 3 steps, essentially. First, my colleague Eva Barszczewskaite is going to give you a good granular view of the trade-related measures to reduce plastic pollution that have been notified to the WTO, what products those measures target, and to give you a sort of a couple of conceptual ideas about what WTO members could do to build on what you have. Many of the measures that have been notified, you're going to see, are in fact the trade policy components of broader environmental policy measures. First lesson. So to help us understand how the trade policy components link into the broader plastics policy world, we have Rachel Karasik, yes, who's a senior policy associate at the Nicholas Institute. And we've asked her to essentially compare what we see and they have seen in WTO notifications with the broader picture of policy measures for plastic pollution, which they have also collected in a much wider database about measures to address plastic policy, to address plastic pollution. So that we think will help us understand how the very trade-related measures sit within the broader policy landscape and give us some insights about what parts of the plastic problem it seems trade-related policies don't yet address, but perhaps could. And then I'll turn to Megan Jungwi-Wantanaporn from the Pew Charitable Trusts, who's going to help us see what kinds of plastic in particular Pew's research tells us could be the focus of further measures to reduce plastic pollution. So these insights we hope will be useful input to you government delegates here in the WTO as you consider the points you might want to bring to the Dialogue on Plastic Pollution workshop, which takes place next week. But also we hope it's useful input to your own government's thinking about, as you think and as you consider what trade-related measures it makes sense to discuss, perhaps to coordinate in designing here at the WTO. So with that long introduction, 3 pieces, bringing you essentially the best research insights we can to help inform your thinking about what you could do next, both in the DPP process, but also in your plastics policies more generally. So once will walk through the three presentations, I may pause after each of them if there are particular points of clarification that I'd like to bring out. But after that, we'll have time for questions and answers and discussion. For those of you in the room and for those of you online, please be aware this seminar is being recorded, but we will not be putting online the discussion part. So we will post onto our website both the slides that are used and the presentation so people can see them and you have them for reference later. But do not worry that a question you ask is going to be put online. It will not be. And I hope that encourages you to ask all of the questions you would want to ask without any fear of being exposed. A very last point for those of you online, thank you for joining us. We know it's really early where some of you are. What I'd encourage you to do is to put any questions that you have into the chat box, which you'll see on your screen. We'll be monitoring that chat box, and as there are particular questions we can bring into the discussion at the end, those questions will appear on my phone, and I'll feed them into discussion as best I can. So with that, Yeva, I might hand over the floor to you first.
Thanks a lot, Alice, for this excellent presentation and for this scene setting that I think takes really us to a very good place to start a discussion about what do the trade delegates actually know? We have heard trade being mentioned so many times at of course, the DPP discussions, the dialogue of plastic pollution have been diving in that issue a lot, but we also saw an excellent review from CL recently, seeing how many trade-related submissions have been also submitted to the INC. So where do we are in terms of the national trade policies that have been notified to the WTO? The way we approach our research is basically we dug into the notifications that are submitted to the WTO, trying to understand what type of trade measures are being notified. What is their scope? What products are being targeted? And are we really diverse? So is there a range, or are we all doing more or less the same thing? What we did, we also focused on the reduction measures. So quite a few measures that will be collected in a database will also be related to what can be defined only in the brackets as better plastics. So the standards that are related to biodegradable plastics were not discussed in our policy brief. We really looked into each measure, read through every single one of them, at least twice, trying to figure out what it actually does for a plastics pollution and what is the way that each member is trying to target that problem in their economies. Then we tried to try to look at the distribution of such measures by region, by members' development, by the type of measures that are applied, by the types of plastics that are targeted. We will be zooming in a little bit on bans and prohibitions, as they seem to be a really important measure for quite a few members. But we also wanted to highlight the diversity of approaches that are found and ask ourselves, what is the lower use of certain approaches mean, and is there a potential there? So let's break it to numbers. We did look at 211 plastics-related notifications collected in WTO's environmental database, out of which we sorted out 93 unique reduction measures by 70 WTO members. And here, let's roll just a tiny bit back to ask ourselves how the data landed in the EDB. You know that there is an effort by the Secretariat to look at the whole huge pool of notifications that are being received at our organization every year and try to link them with their environmental goals. But the first recipient, if you want, by these notifications is not the EDB or not any plastics-related committee, because there's none, but rather the committee is dealing with technical barriers to trade, with import licensing, with market access, with sanitary and phytosanitary issues, as well as with subsidies or even government procurement. So as mentioned, there is no specific obligation to notify such measures to Trade Environment Committee or even Trade and Development Committee. And there's also a bit of measures that are not being notified to the WTO at all. For example, when we think about internal taxes for plastics, that is a type of information that we were not expecting to find in the EDB, and we didn't. So here we are. Who's notifying? And you will look at this map and you will ask yourself, but isn't it reflecting more or less the number of countries in each region? And this is the answer is probably yes. We found we found it really surprising in a pleasant way that members who were notifying the measures were so broad and wide across the globe. They have ranged between the LDC members, the developing country members, and of course developed country members. We see maybe a tiny bit lower amount of notifications in Africa than we could be expecting. However, it's clear that this is an issue that is very important to all members. When we look at the type of measures notified, we see ban and prohibition highly figuring it out. And you will be like, yeah, but this is not how we saw issues reported in the committees. And this is a qualitative judgment that me and my colleague Tristan, whom you see in the corner, made by looking at those notifications. Not only we looked at something that was notified as technical regulation or import licensing requirement, we also asked what that measure does. Does it prohibit a specific worse type of plastic from getting into a specific market? Does it completely disqualify the circulation of that type of plastics or import of that type of plastics? And that would really landed us on a reasonably high amount of bans, which you don't see because of my face being splashed there, but it's 60 bans and prohibitions. You see that technical regulations were still very important because members were not only prohibited things, they were also trying to define other important aspects of their plastics policy through technical regulations, as well as through import licensing. You will see that conformity assessments were also a used procedure. Export licenses were mostly linked to plastic waste. And there was an interesting case of subsidies as well as other measures. When we look at types of plastics, this is where the question is. When we start thinking about so how do we reduce the plastics? Where do we start? This is the list that we thought could be a starting point. We saw members using measures targeting plastic bags, plastic waste, plastic packaging, plastic food containers, tableware, bottles, straws, rigid plastic foam, cotton buds, and microplastics in a very broad sense. And you will notice that this is a really limited range of products. We are mostly targeting the retail sector and the food takeaway, delivery, food consumption items. This is not as broad as a whole economy. The only exemption being plastic packaging measures that can be quite broad or quite narrow. There was a very broad range of approaches there. And then we looked into what was being prohibited and how, because I think for any trade policy maker, the important question is, so is it an environmental measure or are we doing a light touch of protectionism there? And the principal indication, of course, would be the bans that explicitly focus on import prohibition only, thus leaving the internal market for domestic producers. And that was not the case. Somewhat pleasantly, we realized that most of the bans and prohibitions were actually targeting a specific product at the different stages of its circulation in the markets. It could target the import, sale, and manufacture at once. It could target import, sale, and use. It could be targeting the free distribution. It was often the plastic bags that are prohibited. And only in 2 cases, it was targeting the exports. This is important when we think about different policy possibilities, but also the existing practices and how members go about it. There is a specific case on plastic waste because it's already determined by existing instruments, and it's probably the only type of product that's only targeted by import ban, because in this very specific case, members are dealing with non-consumer product. They're dealing with the plastics at the very end of their life cycle. So there's a policy logic behind those bans that I think influence, of course, the plastics amendment to the Basel Convention. And that's really a very unique instrument in that regard. Now, when we thought about how members are shaping up the bans, I'll just ask for your patience here while I'm really moving down this box. Here we are. I think we're better. We asked how members are shaping up their bans. And the definition of a product to be banned could have been quite different. Sometimes a material composition could be the determining factor. In particular, what types of polymers are used, like what amount of recycled content needs to be added. Sometimes it's rather the physical properties, and the good example there could be the plastic bags. I think the whole scope between the regulations targeting plastic bags are going between 15 microns and 250. So each jurisdiction had to define for themselves on what type of requirement works for them. There could have been a requirement for the reuse of a product, basically prohibiting the products that cannot be reused again after the first use. There have been also prohibitions targeting specific uses, and in particular focusing on plastic bags used in retail sector or plastic foam containers that are used for the food takeaways, but leaving them for other sectors of the economy. There have been also end-of-life considerations, for example, targeting non-biodegradable products or products that are difficult to recycle. At the same time, many members recognize the need for exemption, especially when a ban was broader reaching. And those exemptions could have been shaped keeping some particular qualities in mind: the biodegradability, the compostability. There could have been exceptions for particular uses. You can think about plastic straws as being universally recognized as rather harmful product. But at the same time, there have been a recognition in certain jurisdictions that the medical sector cannot survive without them. There have been exceptions made, for example, for sectors such as health or agriculture or certain food sectors, especially when we think about sachets for food packaging, and specific situations like the situations where there are no substitutes in the market, or the emergency situations where anything might actually be needed for the sake of a population. We also thought about the ways that bans are being introduced. It's of course a bit of a question of mechanics, but some governments probably reacted to the environmental emergency by introducing those bans and prohibitions in a reasonably rapid manner, whereas others have really allowed more time for the businesses and for the economies to adjust. Sometimes the bans would come in certain gradual steps, gradually excluding, for example, bags with a certain degree of recycled material from the market, and introducing the stricter and stricter criteria as the time was going. I'm leaving this table with you. I will not be reading out all of your names. We just try to attach the country names from the research that we did to the products that were targeted by existing bans and prohibitions in the way that we saw them. Once again, this is a data coming from the WTO's notifications and from the EDB. We don't pretend that it covers the whole universe, and I think you will see that UNEP is being much more generous in terms of who's doing what. But I'm just trying to give you a bit of time. And to anyone who's trying to snap the pictures, I'll just confirm that the slides will absolutely be available for you to analyze it closer. I will also mention that the data is only the data collected by 2021. So for those of you who have had some new legislation coming into force last year, this will not be here yet. And then the last question was the other measures, what we call a bit underused measures, but also important measures that were determining other aspects of plastics policy, basically the labeling requirements for recyclability, the EPR schemes, the waste management requirements, We thought that there are not a huge amount of examples notified yet, and we really asked ourselves why. We found some extremely interesting examples in using the government procurement requirements when trying to shape up the criteria that are being used in government procurement, as well as several cases of subsidies for recycling, whether in shape of value-added tax exemptions or grants. And we asked ourselves, how come members are not looking more into this? And here we basically landed on our last slide, which is both a conclusion and a set of questions, because we don't think that existing data can answer everything. But one general question that we had is there a way to have a bit more centralized look at the data that is being collected everywhere at the WTO and talk about it? We thought that Dialogue for Plastics Pollution is an excellent starting point for such discussions, and probably could do more of that. We know that there is a result from a member survey coming in, which would add a lot of interesting points about the effectiveness of such measures, and could allow to develop a dialogue about best practices that cannot be done just by looking at the notification. We also asked ourselves about the possibility to expand those measures geographically. We asked ourselves how we would act if we were a government looking for ways to tame plastic pollution domestically. And we thought that there's a good amount of examples already to look at and possibly adjust as needed and adopt. So could more members be doing the same thing? How the discussion about best practices can actually be assisted by a science here? How can we think better about those requirements, about those technical regulations in a way that science leads us to a more coherent universe that also allows our business and our traders to adjust better? And lastly, but most importantly, I would say, is there a scope for a thematic expansion, if you might? Can we identify more products, and how, that could be targeted? Can we look at the underused measures and think if they can be used a bit more and help our policies to be a bit more coherent and a bit stronger, if you prefer? Are all those policies necessarily reaching their point? But those of them who are, can we also look more into them? And are there any measures that are not yet being adopted by members that could have a high impact that we have not thought about yet individually? And that's, of course, for you members to have. So thanks a lot. I will stop here. I will be looking at Alice, just trying to get the sign if we're doing the questions now, or no.
Very helpful. Rachel, I might turn to you next. And before we go on, I have to apologize for the complete lack of gender balance on this panel. We should have done better. I just, sorry, guys. I really didn't even see it until I sat down. So apologize. We will do better next time. Okay, Rachel, you're newer to the whole kind of WTO trade policy space, but you're in a brilliant position to help us trade policy nerds understand how what we are seeing in this notification database compares to the rest of the world of plastics policies. And you've looked at both. So can you walk us through the analysis that you did and what else you can see out there in the world that would be interesting as an insight for the trade policy makers? Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here. And yeah, you guys are trade policy nerds. I am a plastics policy nerd. So nice to be amongst nerds in general. My name is Rachel Karasik. I am a senior policy associate at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, which is based in the US. So yeah, it might be helpful. I know many of you were present for my colleague John's presentation in the fall. It might be helpful to take a step back and tell you guys a little bit more about why I'm here. So in 2019, my research team started to inventory the landscape of plastic policies around the world. We pulled plastic policy documents on subnational, national, regional, and global scales. This took a lot of time, and so we had decided to put it online as a searchable public inventory. We have since kind of maintained and updated and expanded it in the hopes that it remains useful for this community and the remainder of communities that rely on these sorts of resources to understand the landscape of policy. In addition to that, we also have been able to characterize and assess a subset of those policy documents based on how they're designed. And so we use qualitative analysis software to identify the types of plastics that are targeted in these policy documents, the stages of the life cycle that are targeted or intended to be affected by these plastic policy documents, and the range of policy instruments that are used to target plastic. And so we have this inventory of close to 900 policy documents, and then internally we have a lot of data about how they're designed. And that gives us, from a very kind of bird's eye view, a perspective of broad trends and gaps in the policy landscape. And so I'm here because we were able to compare those broad trends and gaps to what we're seeing in the trade policy landscape when it comes to plastic, and particularly similar to Yeva's approach, what is actually being notified to the WTO. And so just to repeat, we really wanted to understand the extent to which trade policy is used and communicated to address plastic pollution, and understand better the role that trade policy and this body can have in coordinating international government approaches to the problem. And again, I come from the plastics policy space, so some of our language is probably a little bit different. So I want to introduce you to the term that we use to understand this. So in our inventory of plastic policies, we consider this sort of subset of policies, trade-related plastic policies. We consider policies to be laws and regulations, as well as action plans and standards. So anything that ranges from, binding and with teeth to a little bit on the softer side, but is passed and executed by a governing body. And these policies have to include at least one instrument that may affect trade of plastic between countries with the intent of addressing plastic pollution, but it may contain other elements that maybe go kind of beyond or are in addition to the trade aspect of the plastics life cycle. So I'll be using that term a lot. We form the basis of our research in the same way that the IIST team did. So we reviewed these 211 notifications that were submitted between 2009 and 2021. And what we did then was, based on the measures being notified and the policies identified in the notification text itself, we linked those to the policy documents in our inventory. And when we weren't able to find a policy document in our inventory, but the measure was very clearly about an intent to address plastic pollution, we found that policy document. So it also helped us expand our inventory, which was a double bonus. After that, we conducted a similar assessment on a subset of these policy documents, these trade-related policy documents, to understand and identify the characteristics and elements of design. So plastic types targeted within the policy document, stages of the life cycle, and the instruments used. And the last thing we did is we tried to understand what the literature, the published literature, is saying of the effectiveness of these specific trade-related plastic policy documents. So in addition to our policy inventory, we also have an effectiveness literature inventory that is similarly linked to individual policy documents. And so we were able to extract which of the trade-related policy documents in our sample also had published literature and synthesize that. I'll quickly walk you through all of these numbers, but just to understand where we were at. So we started with 211 notifications. We had a similar process of opening them and reviewing them and linking them. From that, we got 98 notifications that were linked to trade-related policy documents in our inventory. Part of the reason is because some of the notifications were outside of the scope of what we consider a plastics policy document. And sometimes because sometimes we were not able to find a policy document. And sometimes because of translation limitations, we weren't able to confirm whether or not the policy that was being notified fell within our scope. From those 98 notifications, as many of you know far better than me, oftentimes a policy will be iteratively notified to the WTO over time if there are changes or amendments. So those 98 notifications were then kind of identifying 62 specific trade-related policy documents. So that kind of became our sample where we moved away from the notifications and into this subset of policy documents. And then we wanted to limit our scope of policy documents to match the WTO's notifications database. So we removed 5 that were passed either before or after 2009 or 2021 to maintain that sort of methodological robustness. So we are working with a subset of 57 individual policy documents that have been notified to the WTO that are related to trade and plastic. We organized our research into a few different questions, and I'll walk you through those now. So one is sort of bean counting. How many governments have notified these trade-related plastic policies to the WTO, and how do these notifications compare to our global landscape? And some of our findings are going to be really, really similar to Yeva's. So if they are, I'll breeze through them. So one is, in terms of sort of charting them across time, there is a fairly clear global trend of increasing notifications on plastic to WTO. And this is the policy documents charted over time. I mapped this onto our plastics policy inventory to see if the trend matches. It does match. We've been seeing an increase in policy documents basically since 2000, though the sample includes 2000, starts with 2009. On the left hand of the y-axis, you have the number of national policies within our inventory. And on the right hand of the y-axis, you have the number of trade-related policies that we've counted. So the scale is a bit different, though the trends match. On average, about 12.5% of these trade-related policy documents comprise our national plastic policy landscape. So we were just looking at our national plastic policies as a subset for the same amount of time, which is not an insignificant amount of policies that have been notified to the WTO that are related to plastic. That's not to say that these are all the trade-related policies, just the ones that have been notified. One thing that I think is important to note is of the 10 largest estimated generators of plastic waste, only 4 have notified trade-related plastic policies to the WTO, in addition to the European Union, which is sometimes measured in terms of its plastic waste generation as a unit. Those countries do have plastic policies, but they haven't been notified. We looked at income levels based on the World Bank income classification, so a similar analysis to what IISD did to understand the relative proportions and if they match between the two. And I think the main finding is that there is a higher proportion of trade relevant policy documents that are being notified from higher income countries. I'm newer to the space, but my understanding is that it's fairly consistent with trends in notifications overall. And I think the important finding here is that there is a larger share of policy actions coming from, middle and lower income countries than what might be seen in this subset of WTO notifications on plastic. We did a similar analysis again to Yeva and looking at the WTO region groups and the proportion and distribution of policies. Then they match fairly evenly with policies from Europe kind of outpacing what we're seeing in this subset of trade-related policy documents, and then trade-related policy documents in North America and the Middle East being somewhat overrepresented compared to the overall landscape of policies. So now we want to dive into the content of these policy documents and understand if there are other policy documents that, based on their design, have not been notified to the WTO, but might be considered trade-related policies. We also wanted to understand the design of these policies, and in addition to kind of instruments that target trade, how else these policies are targeting plastic. which is again, getting to some of the findings of IISD. So this is the way that we characterize our analysis of plastic types. We wanted to see, well, we have bags, tires, marine sources, macroplastics, microplastics, and an all category, which is more for a general vague approach to plastics. And so in both samples, we really see a focus on bags and macroplastics, which comprise of single-use plastics and plastic waste. There is slightly more proportion of policies in our inventory that focus on marine sources and microplastics than in this trade-related subset, which might suggest that trade-related policies are underutilized in terms of their targeting of marine sources of plastic pollution and microplastics. We then did a similar analysis for the policy instruments that we categorize for our review and our assessment of policy design, and similarly found that plastic bans tend to be the dominant form of regulation. In the trade policy subset, limitations on plastic via sort of import licensing requirements for restricted plastics are more highly proportional than to the overall inventory. But there are a number of instruments that I think could be considered underutilized in this trade policy subset. So instruments around research and monitoring, outreach, economic instruments such as subsidies and tax breaks, and then post-leakage capture of plastic are an example of some of those instruments that we're not seeing as much in this subset of trade policies. And just to list those out for you, these were the sort of instrument types that we saw not included in the trade policy subset. So post-leakage capture and a number of economic instruments, so deposit return schemes, subsidies, and tax breaks. The life cycle stages that we didn't see in the trade policy landscape include collection, disposal, recycling, the sort of waste management policies, and also reuse, which I think could be fit into the trade policy landscape potentially. And then again, microplastics and marine sources of plastic pollution were not well covered proportionally in the trade policy landscape. Again, a similar analysis, we saw that the majority of these trade-related policies didn't focus exclusively on the trade of plastic. So they often targeted the manufacture, import, distribution, and sale of products, particularly with single-use plastic and bag bans or bans of microplastics. And then a much smaller sample within this sample only targeted trade. And so these were mostly the import bans for plastic waste and to some extent labeling requirements for imports. So we see that, trade-related policies can be sort of broad in how much of the plastics life cycle that they can cover beyond the trade of products or waste. And then we wanted to see what is in the published literature on policy effectiveness. And like I said, we try to link effectiveness studies to specific policy documents. So there's a broader literature on these policy types being assessed, but we wanted to look at these specific policies. And so we found 3 existing studies that look at trade policies and determine their effectiveness. So one is for a plastic waste import permit policy in Malaysia. Another one is for an import plastic waste ban in Vietnam, and the other is the infamous sword policy from China. And they have mixed results. So Malaysia's seem to be effective in being able to close illegal recycling plants. Vietnam's has been reported as ineffective, and China's waste ban has led to a decrease in the import of plastic waste, but has had auxiliary impacts to countries that used to import their waste, in particular the US, where waste disposal has gone up significantly since the waste ban. So all of that to say is there's a small evidence base for understanding the implications of the implementation of these policies. So that's sort of our general findings. There were some sort of challenges in monitoring the use of these trade-related plastic policies. One is that, within these notifications, there is not consistency in how products are being reported and the definitions that are used. And this is also true in the overall policy landscape, but it makes it really difficult to actually track the trade of which products are covered. So this is just an example of the differing ways in which ICS and HS codes are used and how they're also covered in text. Another challenge, again, is that we weren't able to find some policies to include in our analysis. We are, the experts for viewing these notifications, and so we had to make judgments as to what to include or exclude. So there could be some uncertainty there. The limited effectiveness studies makes it hard to understand the implications of these policies. And within that scope of limited effectiveness studies, those studies don't use causal inference methods, which allow us to really understand the actual effect of the policy on the outcome being measured. So there are some uncertainties to this research that should be considered. We think the key takeaways here is that more plastic policies have a trade dimension and component and are not notified to the WTO, which can make it hard to track the ways in which the trade of plastics is covered through policy. Trade-related policies do often focus on, bans or limitations on bags, single-use plastic products, or waste. I think that's similar to Yeva's finding, and these are encompassing of many stages of the life cycle, not just imports or exports. We find that compared to the global landscape of policies, reuse, microplastics, marine sources, post-leakage capture, and different economic instruments could be considered underutilized or under-notified. And, we acknowledge that plastics are an essential part of global supply chains. And right now they're currently kind of facing this patchwork of very different regulations. And so, we see the WTO as being able to provide a forum for kind of enabling that coordination of how we respond to plastic pollution, particularly in the trade absence. And that's sort of in the absence of any coordinated standards or approaches that exist. So that's us. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun to dive into this world, and we have a lot of policies. We have a lot of data on the back end on those policies. So please don't hesitate to reach out if it would be useful for you all to get a better sense of what's out there, kind of beyond what's notified to the WTO currently.
Super. Well, Rachel, thank you very much indeed. Megan, remind us in part about the insights from Breaking the Plastic Wave. It's been out for a few years, but not everyone in the room will be familiar with it. And I know that your slides extract really helpfully some of the key things that from your perspective, members should be thinking about in this expansion phase. Go ahead.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for everyone in the room and in the online room for being here today. Yes, my name is Megan Jumi-Watanapan from the Pew Charitable Trusts, and delighted to be here today with you all. Before jumping into the substance, perhaps just a few words of introduction. The Pew Charitable Trust is a nonprofit organization, and we have offices based in Brussels, London, and Washington, D.C., which is where I am. Our Preventing Ocean Plastics project started in 2018, has been working with governments, businesses, scientists, other non-governmental organizations, and civil society to better understand the global problem of marine plastic pollution and to identify solutions to reduce the amount of plastic entering the ocean. So today I'd like to present to you a few key priorities for plastics reduction as we think about how to tackle the plastics pollution problem, especially ahead of next week's Reduce workshop. But first, now, many of you will have seen this excellent graph from UNCTAD before, but I do think it's worth revisiting. This graph shows that global exports of plastics or goods made from plastic has more than doubled in value since 2005. There's 369 metric tons of plastic exported in 2021, and that's the equivalent of 18.4 million trucks, each carrying 20 tons. So there's a lot of trade in plastics. That's across many different products, through many different countries, and there will be many different solutions to the plastics problem, and these solutions will need to be tailored to varying contexts across countries, with different capabilities and needs. Those solutions themselves will often have knock-on effects for domestic economies and for the global economy that will also need to be considered. Members have created this space at the WTO to discuss how to move towards a global trading regime that protects the environment, and it therefore makes perfect sense to discuss the problem of plastic pollution here. And I think I want to emphasize that the importance of a forum for discussion should itself not be underestimated. But turning to Pew's research, in Breaking the Plastic Wave, which Alice has mentioned, we conducted an analysis with our partners and found that the business as usual trajectory will become unmanageable. Plastic production is projected to double over the next 20 years, and that would result in 3 times as much plastic waste going into the ocean per year, which in turn would quadruple the amount of plastic that is already in the ocean. And so much of what I will talk about today will be drawn from this research. So our research shows that though there is no one silver bullet solution to solving the plastic problem, governments and businesses have the tools today to reduce plastic pollution by 80% by 2040. We need a system-wide approach such that the entire plastic system needs to be reformed to meaningfully reduce plastic pollution from current levels by 2040. And ahead of next week's pre-plenary Reduce workshop, my presentation today will focus on leveraging the findings from Breaking the Plastic Wave to inform thinking in the DPP's Reduce workstream. And just to turn to this graph, you can see the different interventions, we call them wedges, that could be implemented to get us from that business as usual curve down to what we're calling our system change scenario. So to dig into those numbers, broadly speaking, by 2040, nearly half of the plastic in the global system under a business as usual scenario could be removed through upstream solutions in our system change scenario. So that'll involve addressing plastic. 30% of it will need to be reduced. And so that's plastic that will have to just go away. It will not be replaced. 17% of the plastic will need to be addressed through substituting plastics with other materials. So that is plastics that will be replaced. We'll have to double our capability or capacity for mechanical recycling. And then the planned expansion of virgin plastic production will need to reverse its trend and drop by 11% from 2016 levels. So when you look at all those numbers, what this means is that reduction and substitution solutions could make up half of the solutions to tackle the plastic pollution problem. These are ambitious yet feasible system changes that could dramatically cut plastic waste going into our lands and oceans. Now, when we refer to the reduce wedge in our research in Breaking the Plastic Wave, we model 3 interventions. First, eliminating avoidable plastic, which accounts for a reduction in 34 million metric tons of plastic waste utility. Second is replacing single-use products with reusable items, accounting for 15 million tons. And third is new delivery models, accounting for 76 million metric tons. And so those 3 categories: eliminate, reuse by the consumer, reuse in new delivery models, that accounts for the 30% that I mentioned in the previous slide. Now, eliminating avoidable plastics will require policy interventions, innovations, shifts in consumer behavior that reduce plastic demand in a way that the product does not require a replacement. Reuse by the consumer will include replacement of single-use products with items that can be reused by the owner, and reuse with new delivery models involves services and businesses providing ways to obtain products without single-use plastics. And that can involve refill systems, subscription services, take-back systems, etc. And new delivery models are going to be an important part of the system change scenario, although many reduced policies right now are focused on bans, as we heard earlier today. We should also be considering ways to incentivize businesses to implement reusable systems. Now, our modeling shows that there are 5 product types contributing to 85% of all plastic leaking into the ocean today. And these 5 product types are monomaterial films, such as cling wrap or plastic wrap, carrier bags, bottles, sachets and multi-layers, such as condiment packages or single portion shampoo packages. And then the fifth is household goods. Now, if you think of in the food and beverage industry, across 4 of the categories that are heavily used there, like plastic film, sachets, carrier bags, and plastic bottles, about half of the plastic use will have to be eliminated, replaced with refill and reuse systems, substituted with recyclables, biodegradable or compostable materials. These changes, once implemented, would actually save industry and governments money in waste management costs to an estimated savings of $70 billion over the next 20 years. So switching to new materials can actually be quite economically desirable. As you can see in this graphic, we also model which interventions would be most appropriate for these 5 plastic types in order to get us to that 80% reduction of plastic pollution by 2040. And you can see that reduce is an important solution for many of these plastic types. So that's 25% for monomaterial films, 45% for carrier bags, 43% for bottles, and 44% for sachets and multi-layer films. Now, that can be a lot of information to take in, and it can be difficult to know where to begin with the plastic pollution problem. So I want to focus next on 3 recommendations for you to consider as you think about how your country might reduce its plastic pollution, and then how can you collectively leverage individual action going forward. And so as the Chinese proverb goes, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So our first recommendation is to phase in solutions. You have to start somewhere, and then you can build from there. After all, Rome wasn't built in a day. As we've already heard today, many members are already taking steps to reduce plastic pollution, primarily through bans on certain types of plastic applications, such as carrier bags. So in the near term, members should continue to focus on eliminating avoidable products that result in the most waste or leakage. And that is, again, monomaterial films, carrier bags, bottles, sachets, and multi-layers, as well as household goods. And we should also remember going forward that while some products can be replaced with a substitute, that will need careful consideration going forward, and not all products will require replacement. Discussion in the DPP about measures members are already taking could help members to expand solutions geographically so that more countries implement restrictions on certain products, or expand thematically to target other key products, as we heard about earlier from our colleagues at IISD. We can learn from what has already been done while also considering gaps in our policymaking in the road ahead. Specifically, how are we going to phase in solutions for other wedges or interventions such as substitution, recycling, noting that adapting economies to new ways of working takes time. Not all changes should or can arrive all at once. So, recommendation 2. Recognize that one size doesn't fit all. As you discuss what you're already doing, remember that solutions needed in Los Angeles or London may vary from the solutions needed in Jakarta or Johannesburg. And it's only by targeting interventions to the needs of the local infrastructure, wealth, capacity to fund innovation, and other important considerations that we will be able to truly start breaking the wave of plastic pollution at a global scale. We need to have a coherent strategy to solve this urgent problem, and international collaboration will be critical to succeed. And to be successful, the action from each actor will depend on the actions set by others. Our third recommendation is to learn as we go. System change is an iterative process. Fortunately, we have the WTO DPP, which is an excellent forum for considering the global economic and environmental implications of policies. We don't need to tackle the entire plastic pollution problem today or even at MC13. It took us several decades to create the plastic pollution problem, and we won't solve it by next week. We do, however, need a roadmap laying out how we are going to tackle this problem. So MC13 will be the first step in our journey, and we need to set out multiple steps for a long-term future. We need to think about how to leverage the DPP to build policy coherence through this iterative process. Specifically, how can the DPP help to bring coherence to policies across the plastics life cycle within and between countries, thus building this feedback loop. Feeding back lessons learned, information, insights from the DPP to your capitals is a critical function of the DPP. Intra-governmental cooperation is just as important as intergovernmental cooperation in fighting plastic pollution. Just as we need action from industry and consumers, in addition to government policy change in order to deliver the system change that is needed. So in summary, by working together towards a system change, we can start on the path to stopping plastic pollution. Remember that the reduce wedge in our analysis removes 30% of the plastic that would exist under a business as usual scenario, and is where I've focused my remarks today. But there are other critically important solutions and interventions elsewhere that should not be ignored. Eliminating avoidable plastic, however, is a good near-term goal. And then we look forward to continuing to support your efforts to tackle the tens of millions of metric tons of plastic that is entering the ocean each year, and happy to answer questions today or later. Sorry that our links went blue, but please do contact me if you have any more questions.
Super, thank you very much indeed, Megan. And don't worry, everyone, you will get the slides, so you will see the blue links and be able to click on them directly. Megan, thanks. That was really useful, and I think it's useful input for members as they think about what next. I'm conscious we're a few minutes over time, so I will move to conclude. Thank you very much to all three of you. I thought that was really useful, really clear. I hope for those of you listening that these research insights and the structures that we're proposing to think about what next give you useful insight, give you a sense of what your governments are already doing and what you might be able to do next, how you can have those discussions and what sort of input is available to help you populate those different structures with ideas about what to do next. And just to make sure everyone's aware, the results that Yeva's presenting are not yet public. This was a sneak preview. But what it means is that you'll have a policy brief available soon, which sets out all of these different options. We wanted to make sure you had a sense of what the findings were going into the reduction workshop next week. So thank you very much all for coming. Thank you very much to those of you online. Thank you to all of those who supported the organization of the Secretariat, both within ISD and in our partners and various governments who've helped along the way. We're very grateful. All right, thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon. And if you're in the Western Hemisphere, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.